welcome or welcome back to my channel. This is Fiona at Drawings in a Drawer, and today I'm going to talk about painting the watercolour eye. I was flipping through this sketchbook and I found this painting of a watercolour eye, and I decided to recreate it on my watercolour block. Painting the watercolour eye is something that I love and that I've done hundreds of times by now, so I wanted to share my process with you. I start off really loose and watery using a mix of burnt umber, cadmium red light and yellow ochre or raw sienna, and I immediately add splatters with my wet brush just to break the ice and get that feeling of looseness. And this really helps me to break the ice. And then I go in and add some carmine or Madder Lake red light. As you can see, I do not hesitate to go into the white of the eyeball as well, and I like adding a lot of redness all around the eye area. It is also very early on that I will do some lifting with my clean, damp brush, and you can do this quite easily. And then I add some burnt umber around the eye because there's very often some darkness or discoloration around the eye, so I like to get that in. And I also start getting the shadows in using the burnt umber as well. I don't go too dark yet, but at the same time I also know that watercolour dries lighter. So I know that I will have to build up my layers to achieve the darker shadows. I will use Madder Lake red light to go into the lower rim of the eye and into the tear duct. I will be using a smaller brush, a synthetic brush that offers more control. And then I will go into the root of the eyelashes and start to add a little bit more definition there as well. I use quinacridone violet around the eye, on the eyelid, and anywhere I see that colour in my reference image. And usually this is a colour that features quite heavily in most skin tones, so it's a good idea to use it. As always, I cannot stress enough how important it is not to leave the eyeball white. The eyeball is actually a ball, so there is shadows where it curves back into the head, and naturally it is just not white. If you paint the eyeball white, it will appear flat and cartoonish. I usually go in on top of the first layer, which was what I used for the mixed tone, with some ultramarine blue. And here you can see me add some quinacridone violet on top of the shadow at the corner of the face, where the skin meets the hairline, so to speak, or that strand of hair. And I'm using just green by White Nights to go into the iris. And then I go into the bottom part of the iris and do some lifting with my clean, barely damp brush. I like doing that because the bottom half of the iris is usually lighter than the top part, where there is a shadow cast by the eyelid. Picking up some indigo, I go into the shadow at the top of the iris to darken it up. And then I go around the iris to create that darker ring. Some eyes actually do have this darker ring around the iris, but the reason I have it in there is just because it really helps make the iris pop a little bit more. And then I use the wet and wet technique to go into the top of the iris again and make that shadow softer. To create the hair and make it very expressive, I use the wet and wet technique again, using some raw sienna and then just dropping some ultramarine blue and some chromium green by White Nights as well. This area has to dry naturally so we can get some lovely blooms and cauliflower effects in it. And if we use a heat tool or a hairdryer in it, then we will not get those effects as easily. So be careful just that you don't mess it up or that you accidentally put your hand in it while you go on painting the eye. I go in with some sepia just to get the root of those eyelashes in there again. And as you can see, I will then go into the side of the face to darken up that shadow with the sepia again. You will find with watercolour that you will constantly have to add to your shadows because, as I've said earlier in the video, these dry so much lighter, everything dries so much lighter that it's just a matter of building and building layers. So I'm just using that sepia to get that sharp shadow in at the side of the face. And again, I'm using that colour to get this shadow cast by a strand of hair which is not really visible in the picture. And I'm painting that in This shadow kind of falls across the eye into the eyeball and then continues below the eye. You can see there's a darker area on the rim of the eye as well. That's because the shadow is cast on that area, but it would be a different colour, so we have more of a reddish tone in that spot. And then using black, I go into the pupil. Of course, make sure that you have a mixture that is very pasty and creamy at this stage. You don't want any of it bleeding around the eye area or the rest of your painting. And I'm using that again to go into the root of the eyelashes just to get that definition in there and make everything pop. And I'm using this colour again to go in and cast that really dark shadow at the top of the iris, as I felt again that things had dried a little bit too light for me and I really just wanted it to pop. And then using some burnt umber, I'm going around the pupil to add those dots of colour which are very often present in hazel or green bluish eyes around the pupil area. You can be quite random with this, it doesn't have to be specific in any way. I'm using some cadmium red light mixed with some golden by White Nights to go around the eye area. I just like adding redness around the eye because it really helps to make everything kind of stand out and give some emotion to the painting as well. And then I went a bit crazy here and just added some burnt umber, just because in my reference picture I saw quite a lot of colour there. And then by adding water and tilting my block, I got a drip. I didn't like the idea that this looked like a tear a little bit, so I kind of interrupted that flow and went in with some splatters. They do seem quite dark. You can go in with your kitchen paper and pick them up if you don't like the look of them, or you can just be sure that they will dry lighter anyway. And using sepia, I'm going in and adding some strands at the side of the face. They are quite harsh in the beginning, so I go on in just by adding some water and using my brush to soften them up. And once they are dry, I go in and add some definition. As you can see, I'm using a smaller brush. It's a Trykel number 6, and I just make them kind of sharper, closer to the face, and then I use water to soften everything out so we don't lose that natural and nice expressive looseness we have in the rest of the hair. And I'm also adding some cerulean blue just because I really like how it works with the brown underneath. Caput Mortuum is a colour I like using to intensify shadows, so I am using it on the shadow cast by the strand of hair that falls across the eye. This colour is kind of a dark reddish brown, and if you don't have it you can use something like violet and English red or Venetian red to create it yourself. And then using the tip of a fine brush, which is Silver Black Velvet number 2, I am just using burnt umber to go in and start adding some strands of hair. I don't like to go too heavy on the eyebrow as it can be distracting, so unless it's a feature of the specific person that you're painting, I try to make it quite soft. And once I've added the strands and they're halfway dry, I go in with a clean damp brush and soften everything up so that it doesn't attract the eye too much. And I'm just going into the white of the eyeball again to darken up the corners where again the eye, or the sclera, which is the anatomical name of it, curves back into the head. This also helps us because when we go in and add highlights to that area, if we want to do so, they will pop much more. And then I just added some green into the corner of the eye to suggest the shadow created by the top of the bridge of the nose. Using white acrylic gouache, I go in and drop that highlight right next to the pupil. You will see I will go a little bit crazy here again and start adding little pinpricks of highlights not only inside the iris but around the eye where I could see some moisture, so in the lower rim of the eye and also on the skin underneath the eye, and I really loved how this turned out. I hope this was helpful for you, and as usual you can find the full-length narrated tutorial for this painting and many others on my Patreon at the €5 or $5 more or less tier. So I will link it down below, and it's all from me for today. I hope you keep on painting in the meanwhile. See you next Friday.